We continue through our service this morning. Just a few words about some of the announcements. It was announced concerning a cleanup day on May the 15th. What we would like to do is come and do some of the things that it would take a number of hands to do, or at the very least would be more efficiently done with a number of hands. We've got some things we need to move here and there. We've got some things we need to get rid of. We've had some that have done a great job of cleaning out some rooms, but we need to prepare for TBH the next weekend. We need to prepare for the Vacation Bible School that's coming up in the first week or two of June. And so it would be good if we could have all hands on deck. Now, that being said, whenever we choose a time to do something like that, inevitably someone says, "Oh, I can't make it because I've got something going." We understand that. Not everybody can be at everything. But if you can come and help out in whatever capacity on May the 15th, that's a Saturday morning, then we'd love to have you. If you can't be here till 2 or 3 o'clock that afternoon, well then that's fine too. Come when you can and do what you can. But the more that we have helping, the less we all have to do. And so that it doesn't fall on just 1 or 2 of the good folks here who do so much. So let's make plans to help out and be a part of that. We do appreciate the ladies, Margaret and Jean Ann, who clean regularly, and they do a good job, but there are some things that we need to do that are bigger jobs than what they do. And so if you can be a part of that and if you can help, then we'd love to have you do that. And don't forget, TBH, a youth rally coming up May the 22nd. Our gospel meeting coming up, is it the 6th? I always seem to lose the date. It's that very first Sunday in June. Is that the 6th? Do what? VBS. Yes. Well, I'm sorry. Check your calendars for the day. The Vacation Bible School is taking place that first Sunday in June. And I didn't write it down, so speaking off the cuff, sometimes I get confused. So sorry about that. Hopefully there's no confusion. We can have a gospel meeting whenever we want to, but it is June the 6th. It is June the 6th. So mark those things down, please, and let's make plans to be a part of them and to support them as best we can. You can open up your Bibles to Deuteronomy Chapter 9 this morning. Deuteronomy Chapter 9. And it's one of the greatest events in the history of Israel. They are about to enter the promised land. And really the entire book of Deuteronomy is Moses addressing his people, God's people, as they are about to finally enter the land of promise. But what happens when there are problems in this endeavor? And there will be. And they already know that there will be problems. They've already scouted out the land, and they have seen the problems that await them. So what are they going to do? What do you do when there are big problems in the promised land? And as we go through this, what we're going to end up with is, there are often challenges in our lives. Challenges that maybe when we look at them, they seem too big. And what do we do with those big problems? And so hopefully we can talk about those things as we move forward. In the general context of what we're talking about the book of Deuteronomy, of course, which means second law. It is a repeat, and some things are added and expanded on as well, of the law that was given thus far. Now, if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 1, as I mentioned, this was spoken on the brink of Israel entering the land of promise. Verse 1 of chapter 1. These be the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side Jordan in the wilderness, in the plain over against the Red Sea between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab. These are the 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea. So they're on the brink of entering and taking hold of the land of promise. And God, through Moses, has some amazing things to tell them. The thesis of Deuteronomy is found there in chapter 6. The Shema, as it's called in Jewish traditions. In verse number 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and so on and so forth. Hear, O Israel. That word hear indicates not only listening, but listening with the intent to obey. And so Moses is telling the nation of Israel, I need you to listen. You're about to do some great and amazing and wonderful things, but things that will require great dedication. And they will demand great effort from you. I need you to hear. I need you to listen. I need you to obey. The word hear is found some 34 times in the book of Deuteronomy. Interestingly, there are 34 chapters. And 34 times in Deuteronomy, the word hear is mentioned. Now let's get to chapter 9, our text for this morning. And I want you to notice how it starts. Incidentally, chapter 9 and verse 1, Hear, O Israel. That same refrain that we found in the thesis in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4 is found again here in chapter 9 and verse 1. So he says, Hear, O Israel. In verse 1 he continues to say, Thou art to pass over Jordan this day, to go in to possess nations greater and mightier than thyself, cities great and fenced up to heaven, a people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, who thou knowest and of whom thou hast heard say, Who can stand before the children of Anak? You see, Moses is referencing the information brought back by the 10 spies. You remember 12 spies were sent into the land of promise. And 10 of those came back, and do you remember that they had to carry the clusters of grapes on poles between two men? What an amazing event. They said it's a land that flows with milk and honey. And God will go on to tell them that you're going to enter into cities that you didn't build, vineyards that you didn't plant. You're going to have a civilization ready-made for you. But what did those 10 spies say? There are giants in the land. And we are in their sight as grasshoppers. Oh, what are we going to do? Some have called it the Grasshopper Complex. The view that there's this giant problem, literally. And we are so tiny, there's nothing we can do to overcome it. And so Moses, as he says, Listen, Israel, hear, O Israel, you're going to go into that land. That very same land that you heard those 10 spies say, there's giants there, there's giants there. How are you going to face those giants? How are you going to overcome that big problem? Well, this morning what we're going to notice are 3 things that Moses wants Israel to remember that will help them overcome the giants that they face in the land of Israel. And these same 3 things can help us with whatever big problems we might face in our lives. Number 1, Moses says, remember that God goes with you. I want you to pick up in verse 3. Understand, therefore, this day, that the Lord thy God is He which goeth over before thee. You see, what those 10 spies failed to realize is that God was going with them. And God plus any one man is a majority. And so whatever they had to face in the land of promise was nothing in the face of God. And nothing could stand before God. It didn't matter if they were giants. It didn't matter if they had chariots of iron. It didn't matter if they had tanks and cannons. There was nothing that could stand before the God of heaven. And God is going before you. He goes on to say, as a consuming fire, He shall destroy them, and He shall bring them down before thy face. So shalt thou drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord has said unto thee. God goes with you. Now, when I read that, I thought about what God had promised them as He led them out of the land of Egypt. He had said, I will show you the way, quite literally. He said in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 21, the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. So by day He was there as a pillar of cloud, and by night He was there as a pillar of fire. And it says, He took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. God said, I'll always be directly in front of you. I will always be leading the way, and you will be able to see me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night, and I will always be there. And so Israel by now should have understood that God was with them. Notice the very first word in that passage, Deuteronomy 9:3, understand. We need to understand that God will go with us. And sometimes it's so difficult for us to understand that. Sometimes we feel like we're all alone when we face really big problems. And we feel like there's no one there who understands and no one there who can help, and that we're fighting our battles all by ourselves. But certainly, that's not the case. And God told Israel to remember that same thing. Hebrews 13 and verse 5. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for He hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. In Bible class this morning, we were talking about how to study the Bible deeply, and I was talking about resources that they can get. And it's interesting, one resource that I'll show them when we come back next time, because we ran out of time in our Bible class this morning, had this to say about Hebrews 13:5. It says there are 5 negative particles in Hebrews 13:5. That is 5 nots or no's in the original Greek language that are in Hebrews 13:5. In essence, what God is saying by inspiration to the Hebrews writer is, I will never, 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 never leave thee or forsake thee. It's emphatic. You see, in the Greek language, there's no such thing as a double negative. You can string negatives together to emphasize that negative. And so in this text, God is saying there are no circumstances under which I will leave the Christian. Never will it ever happen that I will leave you. And what an amazing statement. And notice it says, He hath said. Interestingly, you can't find a verse in the Old Testament that specifically has those words. But what the Hebrews writer is saying is the general character of the Old Testament and everything that God has ever promised us says He will never leave us nor forsake us. God is going to go with you. And whatever you're facing in life, if you're faithful to Him, He will go before you. Like that pillar of cloud by day, like that pillar of fire by night. He's not going to leave you out stranded by yourself. God is going to be with you. Now there are 2 parts to that passage. Number 1, there's our part. Let our conversation, our manner of life be without covetousness, and let us be content with such things as we have. We've got to understand that God gives us what He gives us, and we've got to find a way to make the best of it. That's our part. So many times we want to say, well, God, what you've done or what you've given or where you've put me is not good enough. But I need to recognize my obligation to say, God, you've put me in this situation, and you can help see me out. Be content with such things as you have. That's our part. And God's part. He will never leave us nor forsake us. God won't put us in anything that He can't help us find a way out of. You see, and that's 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. It sounds trite, doesn't it? But there is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you, will not allow you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. God never promised that it would be simple, that it would be easy. God never told the nation of Israel, hey, when you go over the river Jordan, it's just going to be so simple. You won't even have to lift a sword. They're going to have to work for it. And they're going to have to obey Him. And they're going to have to keep His commands. And they're going to have to be dedicated. But God was going to give them what He promised them if they merely listened with a mind to obey. Our part is be content. God's part, He will give us what we need, and He will be there with us. Those 2 words, leave thee nor forsake thee. The word leave thee means to loosen His hold. God is never going to let you go. And that second word, forsake, means to leave in the lurch. You ever been left in the lurch? You ever been promised by someone, hey, I'll meet you at so-and-so place, and then they never show, and you're just kind of left there wondering where they are? Well, have you ever been stood up on a date There's nothing quite as, embarrassing as going out to a place to meet someone for a date and then them not showing. But God says, I'll never leave you in the lurch. I'll never tell you I'm going to be there and then not be there. If I promise you something, I'm going to do it. God is faithful. And so we need to understand, first of all, that God will go with us. And God told the nation of Israel, you're about to enter into a land that's full of giants. But I'll be with you, and I'll go before you. Number 2, remember that you are more blessed than you deserve. Sometimes that's difficult to do. You ever talk to somebody and you ask them, how are you? And they say, better than I deserve. And some people say that habitually. I wonder if we mean that. Now, sometimes it doesn't feel that we're better than we deserve. Sometimes it feels like we've gotten much less than we deserve. But we need to sometimes take a step back and examine our lives in a grander context. That's what God asked of Israel here. Look at verse 5. He's going to take them, verse 4, for my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. But for the wickedness of these nations the Lord drives thee out from before thee. Not for thy righteousness, verse 5, or for the uprightness of thine heart dost thou go to possess their land. But for the wickedness of those nations the Lord thy God does drive them out from before thee, and that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Understand, therefore, that the Lord thy God giveth thee not this good land to possess it for thy righteousness. And then he says, for thou art a stiff-necked people. God says, I'm not doing this because you deserve it. And isn't it so easy to convince ourselves that the good things we have, we deserve them? As a parent, aren't there competing emotions? One side of me as a father wants to give my children everything they want. I really do want to do that. But then the other side of my life as a parent wants to teach my children to appreciate what they have. And so there are those two competing emotions within my life as a father. To teach my children to appreciate what they have, but also to give them things maybe that I didn't get, and things that they want and things that they need. I love to see my kids happy. But don't we want so much more to see them satisfied and content, and to teach them to appreciate what they have? Well, God said, I want you to understand that you don't deserve this. One of the things that we talk about in our current society is the entitlement philosophy. I deserve this. I'm entitled to this or that. And that's not as new as we think it is. We always like to accuse the newest generation of all of these bad things. Really, that idea has been around as long as humanity's been around. I deserve this. What did Satan tell Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Hey, God just doesn't want you to be happy. You deserve to know what He knows. You deserve to see what He sees. God knows that in the day that you eat thereof, you'll be like Him. And God doesn't want you to do that. God doesn't want you to be happy. That's a lie that Satan tells us all. That you are entitled to everything that you ever wanted. And that if you don't get it, well, you have every right to be upset. But God told Israel, you don't deserve this land. I'm giving it to you by my grace. And that can sometimes help us when we face those big problems. If God gave it to me, God's going to find a way to see me through it. He goes on in Deuteronomy Chapter 9 and 10 to talk about the sins that Israel has committed. He gives them a history lesson. He says, hey, you went out of the land of Egypt and you complained. God gave you manna, you complained. God gave you quail, you complained. God gave you water from a rock, you complained. And every step of the process, you proved yourselves to be a stiff-necked people, stubborn and disrespectful. But then he says God expects you to follow Him, and we'll have more to say about that in just a moment. So if you're facing these big problems, if you find yourself in a situation that's less than ideal, remember humility, such a requirement. In Luke 17, verse 10, Jesus says, so likewise ye, when you shall have done all those things which are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. It's good as often as we can for us to stop and say, man, I've got so much more than I deserve. Sometimes we can, as the saying goes, sprain our shoulder, patting ourselves on the back. Or we can say, I'm blessed and I don't deserve it. Because what so often happens is we don't realize how blessed we are and how little we deserve the things we have until those things are taken away from us. And that's going to be the problem with the nation of Israel, right? They go in, they possess the land of Israel, and they feel like they deserve it, they feel like they're entitled, and they get complacent. And then when it's taken away from them, they say, oh, what was us? And God says, I told you. If you didn't stay in my word, if you didn't remain faithful to me, these things that I'd given you would be taken from you. We must remember it's not for our righteousness. It's not because we deserve it. We're unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. In Isaiah 64 and verse 6, Isaiah says, we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. We could pile up all of the good things we do. We could pile up all of the good stuff we have, and it still wouldn't be enough to deserve what God has done for us and what God has given us. And isn't it so good sometimes for us to remind ourselves of that while things are good, so that when those giants come, we know how to face them? Number one, remember that God will go with you and before you. Number two, remember that you don't necessarily deserve the good things that you get. And number three, remember that God will punish the wicked. You go back to Deuteronomy chapter 9, and I read through verse 5, and I talked about that first part, which says, not for thy righteousness or for the uprightness of thine heart dost thou go to possess their land, but for the wickedness of these nations the Lord thy God does drive them out from before thee, and that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look, I'm going to punish these folks. Some people say, well, why did God destroy the inhabitants of the land of Canaan? Well, because they weren't living as they ought to. They had disobeyed God. And part of Israel's reward was also those nations' punishment. There was at the same time reward for Israel and punishment for those nations that inhabited the land of promise. By way of illustration, I can just use the nation of Edom. You remember Edom? Descendants of Esau. Esau, the relative of the Israelites. And so the Edomites and the Israelites were brethren. And so they ask as they're traveling, will you allow us to take the king's highway straight through the land of Edom? And Edom says, you will not pass. If you come through here, we'll destroy you. And Israel had been in captivity. They didn't know how to fight. And so they were frightened. And God said, you're going to have to go around. You're going to have to make a compass around the land of Edom. But Edom will serve their punishment at a later date. And that's exactly what happened. He promised that in Numbers chapter 24 and in Jeremiah and in Amos. And I've got Amos referenced there in front of you this morning. Amos said, for 3 transgressions of Edom, yea, for 4. Edom was going to suffer their punishment. God will punish the wicked. You see, the giants will fall. And that's something that we need to understand as we face so many of the problems in our lives. One day the ledger will be balanced. Be not deceived. Galatians chapter 6 verses 7 through 9. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. We need to understand that. We need to take a step back for a moment and say there are all of these troubles, there are all of these struggles. God will make the ledger balanced. He that sows to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. And you could add on that next verse where it tells us to be not weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. God goes before us. We don't deserve the good things that we have. And God will punish the wicked. That's what God tells the nation of Israel as they were facing these giants in the land of promise. What I'd like to close with this morning is a statement found in Deuteronomy chapter 10 as Moses is wrapping up this portion of his speech to the nation of Israel, I want you to notice what he says. And this is a passage that maybe you've heard before. Deuteronomy 10, verse 12, and now Israel. What does the Lord thy God require of thee? Can you imagine that Israel has been listening to what Moses has said and been thinking about entering into the land of promise, and how are we going to overcome these obstacles, and what are we going to do, and what does God want us to do? See, how many times do we find ourselves in big problems and we don't say, God, what do you want me to do? Instead, we find ourselves in these big problems and we say, here's what I want you to do, here's what I want them to do, instead of saying, God, what do you want me to do? What can I do in this situation to see my way through it? But so often we don't ask that question. But Moses said, you need to ask that question, and here's the answer. And now, Israel, what does the Lord thy God require of thee but to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in His ways, to love Him, to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and His statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. Notice all of the imperatives: fear, walk, love, serve, keep. Do what God says, and do it with love. Do it honestly and earnestly and sincerely. And if you do that, God will go before you. And that's what Moses promises the nation of Israel. And he sums it up in this one statement. Deuteronomy 10 and verse 16, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart. You know, circumcision was a practice that Israel would know very well. And they practiced it on infants at 8 days old. And those infants didn't remember that event. They didn't know what had happened likely. They just knew the results. But God says, now Israel, I want you to circumcise your heart. I want you to prepare yourselves for this journey that you're going to take in the land of promise. I want you to open up your heart to all of those problems and all of those struggles and all of those challenges. And I want you to let me go before you. And I want you to understand that you don't deserve any of this, but I'm going to give it to you. And I want you to understand at the end of the day that I'm in charge and I will judge the world in righteousness. You see, we need to remember those things ourselves. When there are big problems in the promised land, what do? Well, we remember that God goes before us. And we remember that we don't deserve the good things that we get. And number 3, we understand that God will punish the wicked. This morning, is your heart hardened? Sometimes we face big problems enough and we begin to give up on God. And our heart becomes calloused and closed to His truth. And the nation of Israel, as much as they should have received God's instruction, their heart was closed. Their heart was calloused. Isaiah would say their eyes are closed so they can't see, and their ears are closed that they won't hear. And interestingly, Jesus said the very same thing about them in the New Testament. And unfortunately, there are times when the same can be said about me, and the same can be said about you. This morning, do you need to circumcise your heart? Do you need to say, God, no longer am I going to be calloused and stubborn and disobedient. Today, I'm not going to ask, what should he do? What should they do? God, what should you do? But I'm going to ask, God, what do you require of me? And the answer is simple. Fear the Lord thy God. Walk in His ways, love Him, serve Him, and keep His commandments. This morning, do you need to do that? Keep the commandments of God. What are they? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, Mark 16:16. Do you need to do that this morning? Do you need to make the decision to put Christ on in baptism to wash away your sins? But baptism is not the end. It's the beginning. And maybe as a Christian this morning, you have begun by submitting your life to Christ in obedience. maybe you've strayed. Maybe like Israel, you've become stiff-necked. You've closed your heart. Maybe you've wandered around in the wilderness of sin for years. Maybe it's time to come back. This morning, are you facing giants? Let God help. Let Him go before you. Obey the gospel to be restored as together we stand and sing.